I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
It didn't arrive with a countdown. There was no warning, no teaser, no headline screaming that something big was coming. It just appeared, quietly, almost deliberately unnoticed. And that's the first thing that makes this drop dangerous. Because when something this heavy moves without noise, it's usually not meant for the public first. It's meant for the people who already know what it means. Late last night, Netflix released what 50 Cent is calling the next chapter of the Reckoning the Diddy documentary. And the timing couldn't be worse for anyone hoping this story would fade. Not because it introduces shocking new accusations, but because it rearranges everything you thought you already understood. And once those pieces move, they don't move back. Back in December, when the first documentary dropped, most people believed they were watching the full story. 4 parts, carefully paced, a rise, a fall, and a moment where everything seemed to collapse under its own weight. The industry reacted instantly. Names went quiet, statements slowed, conversations changed tone. But even then, something felt incomplete. Scenes ended too soon. Questions were raised and never returned to. Certain names appeared briefly, then vanished without context. And 50 Cent never pretended otherwise. He kept repeating the same thing in interviews and offhand comments. This wasn't everything. It was what could be shown at the time. This new release doesn't explain that. It doesn't justify itself. It doesn't even introduce itself properly. It assumes you remember what was said before, and more importantly, what wasn't. There's no recap, no handholding, no attempt to catch up casual viewers, and that alone tells you who this chapter is really for. This isn't aimed at people discovering the story for the first time. It's aimed at people who were there when certain moments happened and thought time would do the rest. Before we go any further, I want you to pause for a second and answer this honestly in the comments. If powerful people know damaging footage exists, but it's never officially explained or denied, do you think silence is a coincidence or a strategy? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to stay ahead of where this story is actually going, not where headlines want it to stop, make sure you're subscribed. Because what's unfolding now isn't loud, but it's permanent. What makes this chapter unsettling isn't what it says. It's what it refuses to say out loud. Instead of dramatic narration or direct claims, it slows everything down. It places moments next to each other and lets the tension sit. Clips that once felt isolated now feel connected. Conversations that seemed harmless suddenly carry weight. Not because the documentary tells you they should, but because your memory fills in the gaps on its own. And the timing matters. This didn't drop during a quiet period. It arrived while legal appeals are still pending, while civil cases continue without noise, while people who once spoke confidently are choosing their words carefully or not speaking at all. Silence at this stage isn't neutral. It becomes part of the material. One of the most noticeable shifts in this chapter is where the camera chooses to linger. There's far less focus on public moments. No red carpets, no award shows, no rehearsed interviews. Instead, attention drifts toward the in-between spaces. After parties, private conversations, moments just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. The kinds of moments that usually get cut not because they're explosive, but because they're too revealing when placed in the wrong order. That's where this chapter gains its weight. It doesn't chase shock value. It builds pressure through proximity. The same faces appearing in the same rooms across different years. The same tone used in completely different situations. The same confidence even when circumstances change. Repetition like that doesn't feel accidental. And repetition is how patterns begin to form. What's especially effective is how little explanation is offered. Long stretches pass without commentary. You're shown where people were, who else was present, and how often these configurations repeat. No conclusions are drawn on screen, but your brain starts doing that work anyway. Because once you see events stacked together, instead of spaced years apart, the gaps disappear. And without gaps, forgetting becomes difficult. There's also a noticeable emotional shift compared to the earlier documentary. The first release carried a sense of revelation. This one carries consequence. It feels colder, more restrained, almost resigned, as if the story has moved past outrage and entered a phase where reality settles in quietly. That's when reputations stop reacting and start calcifying. Because outrage burns fast, records don't. Another detail that's hard to ignore is how little resistance this release has faced publicly. No immediate legal barrage. No aggressive attempts to shut it down. Just carefully worded statements insisting that narratives are being twisted. That response raises its own question. If nothing here holds weight, why is the reaction so measured? Why not confront it directly? Why allow implication to linger instead of closing the loop? This chapter doesn't accuse. It doesn't escalate. It simply refuses to let moments exist alone anymore. It compresses time. It removes the spaces where stories used to fade. And once those spaces are gone, consistency becomes visible. Not consistency of actions, but consistency of avoidance, of knowing exactly how much to say and how much not to. By the time you're halfway through, you realize something important has shifted. You're no longer watching to learn what happens next. You're watching to observe how people respond now that the room knows it's being watched. And reactions, or the lack of them, start to say more than any clip ever could. This is where the documentary becomes dangerous not to individuals, but to systems. Systems that rely on time to soften edges. Systems that expect attention to move on before connections fully form. That expectation isn't holding the way it used to, because viewers aren't reacting emotionally anymore. They're watching structurally, comparing, replaying, noticing how often explanations stop just before they become specific. Nothing here feels rushed, and that's intentional. Rushing invites mistakes. Patience invites observation. And observation doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. It lingers. By the end of this stretch, one thing becomes clear without ever being stated. This story no longer needs new material to stay alive. It's feeding on what already exists and on what still hasn't been addressed. Silence stops functioning as a shield. It starts functioning as data. And from here on, every move will be read differently. Not because anything new is proven, but because the pattern is no longer hidden by distance or time. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's where the real pressure begins. Once that pressure sets in, the story stops behaving like content and starts behaving like record. That's the shift most people don't notice at first. Nothing dramatic announces it. No single clip goes viral on its own. Instead, the weight comes from accumulation, from how often the same responses appear in different years, from how consistently explanations circle around clarity without ever landing on it. What this chapter does differently is it refuses to move forward chronologically. It moves sideways. Moments from different eras are placed next to each other without warning. An old interview sits beside a recent silence. A confident statement from years ago is followed by a carefully worded non-answer today. On their own, each moment feels explainable. Together, they feel intentional. This is where the viewer starts to feel something change internally. You're no longer asking, "What happened?" You're asking, "Why does this keep happening the same way?" That question is far more uncomfortable because it doesn't demand proof. It demands recognition. One of the quiet strengths of this release is how it handles absence. Not just what's shown, but who isn't there. Names that were once front and center now feel distant. Voices that used to speak freely are suddenly careful, minimal, or gone entirely. And absence, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. It starts feeling like positioning. The documentary never says this directly. It doesn't need to. It trusts the audience to notice the pattern on their own. And when viewers arrive at conclusions independently, those conclusions stick harder. They don't feel planted. They feel earned. Another layer that slowly emerges is how narratives were managed over time. Not denied, managed. Certain controversies were allowed to surface briefly, just long enough to release pressure before being left unresolved. Statements were made without timelines. Clarifications were offered without specifics. And then time was allowed to step in and do what explanations never could create: distance. Distance is powerful. Distance dulls urgency. Urgency is dangerous to control. What this chapter quietly exposes is how often distance was relied on as a solution, not to resolve questions, but to outlast them. As these moments stack, the viewer starts noticing something else. The language stays consistent even as circumstances change. The tone remains measured. The phrasing avoids absolutes. Nothing false is said, but nothing complete is said either. Incompleteness becomes a recurring feature, not a flaw. And incompleteness is protective. Complete stories demand follow-up. Incomplete ones invite patience. Patience favors those who already hold influence. The documentary leans into this without ever spelling it out. It shows how often accountability is acknowledged in theory, then redirected in practice. How concern is expressed broadly, but specifics remain just out of reach. How responsibility is discussed without ever being placed. What makes this unsettling is how familiar it feels once you see it, not just here, but across the industry. A controversy appears. A brief response follows. Attention peaks, then fades, and the story is quietly labeled as handled. But handled doesn't mean resolved. It just means paused. By compressing years of these moments into a single viewing experience, the documentary removes the illusion of resolution. Gaps that once felt natural now feel conspicuous. Pauses feel longer. Silences feel heavier. Not because of what they hide, but because of how often they repeat. At this stage, the audience's role changes again. You're no longer watching to be informed. You're watching to verify. Every new clip is weighed against memory. Every statement is compared to past versions of itself. Every decision not to engage becomes part of the record. This is where power usually expects attention to fade, where the story should lose momentum, where viewers should move on. But that's not what happens here. Instead of fading, the pressure tightens. The documentary leans into repetition, not of footage, but of behavior. The same types of responses across different crises. The same reliance on reputation to fill in missing details. The same assumption that time will soften perception. Repetition like this doesn't feel dramatic. It feels procedural. And procedure suggests design. What's especially uncomfortable is realizing how effective this approach has been for so long. Not because people were misled, but because the system didn't need to mislead anyone. It only needed to slow things down. Let discomfort dissolve naturally. Let memory fragment. Let attention drift. For years, it worked. This chapter quietly exposes how silence wasn't passive. It was active, timed, placed. Appearing exactly when clarity would have forced alignment between stories that were better kept separate. You start noticing how often explanations stop just before they become specific. How frequently conversations pivot away from timelines. How accountability is replaced with general language. Nothing provable, nothing deniable, just incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. It becomes a method. The documentary never rushes to a conclusion here. It stays with the discomfort. It allows the viewer to sit with the realization that many moments once treated as isolated incidents were actually part of a continuous pattern. Once that realization lands, old material doesn't sound the same anymore. Past confidence feels rehearsed. Distance feels deliberate. Not because anything new has been proven, but because coherence starts replacing coincidence. This is where the story becomes heavier, not louder, heavier. You're no longer looking for a reveal. You're watching reactions, who speaks, who doesn't, who adjusts their language, who creates distance, and silence at this stage stops feeling like restraint. It starts feeling like choice. That's when the balance quietly shifts. The narrative no longer belongs to the people at the center of it. It belongs to the timeline itself, to memory, to comparison, to context. From here on, every absence is noticed, every pause is logged, every non-response adds pressure instead of releasing it, not through noise, through consistency. And consistency, once recognized, becomes impossible to ignore. By the time the stretch ends, the viewer understands something without being told. This story isn't being kept alive by new information. It's being kept alive by unresolved history. And unresolved history doesn't fade when people stop talking about it. It waits quietly. By this point, the tension no longer comes from what's being revealed. It comes from what's being measured. The documentary slows even further, not to build drama, but to widen the lens. Instead of asking what happened next, it starts asking why certain moments were allowed to pass without resolution in the first place. This is where the story stops feeling personal and starts feeling systemic. Not about one individual decision, but about how situations were consistently handled across time. A controversy surfaces, attention spikes. A response is issued brief, careful, incomplete. Then time steps in and quietly does the rest. Time becomes the cleanup crew. The film doesn't frame this as coincidence. It frames it as habit, a habit built over years, refined through experience, protected by reputation, because when a reputation is strong enough, it fills in gaps automatically. People assume explanations exist somewhere, even if they've never actually heard them. Assumption replaces evidence. Comfort replaces clarity. What's unsettling is how familiar this pattern feels once it's pointed out. Not just here, but across countless stories where power and patience intersect. Silence is interpreted as dignity. Distance is mistaken for maturity. Unanswered questions are labeled old news simply because enough time has passed. But time doesn't resolve stories. It spaces them out. By compressing decades of moments into a single narrative flow, the documentary collapses those spaces. Suddenly the gaps are visible. Pauses that once felt natural now feel intentional. Answers that once sounded complete now feel carefully framed. This is where the documentary becomes less about content and more about contrast. Public confidence versus private restraint. Statements made on record versus actions taken off camera. Moments when engagement would have clarified things, and the deliberate choice not to engage instead. The film never claims deception. It highlights separation. Separation allows plausible deniability. It creates enough distance for multiple interpretations to exist without ever colliding. As these contrasts stack, the viewer begins to sense how narratives survive over time, not by controlling every detail, but by controlling engagement. If you don't engage, you don't create new material. If you don't create new material, old material remains unresolved rather than contradicted. That unresolved space is where power prefers to sit. What makes this section especially effective is its restraint. There's no dramatic music telling you how to feel, no captions spelling out implications. Moments are simply placed next to each other, and the friction between them does the work. Friction creates heat. You start remembering interviews you've seen before, but now they feel different. Answers that once sounded confident now feel incomplete. Statements accepted at face value now feel selective, not false, but carefully limited. Selection is a form of control. The documentary also begins to highlight how often responsibility was acknowledged abstractly, but never located specifically. Concern was expressed, regret was implied, but accountability remained dispersed, never anchored to a clear moment or decision. This isn't presented as proof of wrongdoing. It's presented as evidence of method, a method that relies on patience, on allowing attention to burn itself out, on trusting that curiosity will fade before coherence is required. For a long time, that method worked, but something changes here. The audience stops reacting emotionally and starts observing structurally. And instead of asking, "Is this true?" and they ask, "Why does this response always look the same?" That shift is subtle, but irreversible. The documentary leans into repetition, again, not repeating clips, but repeating patterns of response. The same language appearing in different years, the same tone applied to unrelated situations, the same careful distance maintained regardless of context. Repetition like this doesn't shock, it convinces. Because once behavior becomes predictable, it stops feeling accidental. This is where silence takes on a new meaning. It's no longer neutral, it's no longer passive, it becomes a signal that certain explanations would create more clarity than comfort. A signal that some conversations are riskier to finish than to avoid. A signal that distance still feels safer than alignment. The documentary never says this outright. It doesn't need to. It trusts the viewer to arrive there independently. And when viewers reach conclusions on their own, those conclusions linger. They don't dissolve when the video ends. At this stage, the story no longer needs momentum. It has gravity. Gravity doesn't rush. It pulls. You feel it in how the pacing slows, in how silence is stretched just long enough to notice who seems comfortable inside them and who doesn't. That contrast becomes everything. Some people speak broadly, others retreat into generalities, not because they have nothing to say, but because specificity creates reference points. And reference points invite comparison. Comparison is the real threat. The documentary shows how often clarity was postponed, not denied, how explanations were deferred to later, how later rarely arrived, and how postponement over time begins to look like avoidance. This is where the audience stops consuming and starts evaluating, measuring tone, measuring timing, measuring how narratives adjust when pressure increases quietly, not publicly. And pressure does increase, not online, not through outrage, but internally, inside the structure that once relied on time to blur details. Time isn't blurring anything anymore. Old clips carry new weight. Statements that once felt neutral now feel calculated, not false calculated, designed to say enough without ever closing the loop. That's the tension living underneath this part of the story. Nothing explosive happens here, and that's exactly why it works. Explosions burn out, patterns don't, patterns settle in, they stay. They don't ask to be believed. They simply repeat until recognition becomes unavoidable. By now, the viewer understands something quietly powerful. This story no longer belongs to headlines. It belongs to memory, and memory doesn't reset when attention moves on. By the time the story reaches this point, something fundamental has shifted. You're no longer waiting for a revelation. You're watching behavior under observation, and that's a very different kind of pressure. What becomes clear in this final stretch is that power rarely collapses when it's exposed. It adapts. It slows down. It gets quieter. Because silence, when used correctly, buys time. And time has always been the safest place for unfinished stories to hide. But this time isn't erasing anything. It's stacking it. Every past interview that resurfaces now lands differently. Every old clip carries more weight. Statements that once felt neutral suddenly feel engineered, not dishonest, but intentionally incomplete, designed to satisfy the moment without creating a trail that could be followed later. That's the tension now living underneath everything, not outrage, not shock, awareness. The documentary stops focusing on individual moments and starts examining the ecosystem that allowed those moments to repeat. The friends who stayed quiet, the businesses that kept moving forward, the media narratives that softened edges instead of sharpening questions, the structures that remained intact regardless of how many storms passed through. Because one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This was never just about protecting an image. It was about preserving a system. As pressure increased over the years, nothing collapsed outwardly. Instead, strategies evolved. When criticism surfaced, it was reframed. When accusations grew louder, attention was redirected. When legal scrutiny appeared, layers were added. Not to erase what happened, but to manage how it was remembered. This is where the documentary highlights something most people missed in real time. How moments of crisis were often followed by strategic visibility, appearances, statements, carefully timed interviews, content designed to remind the public who someone was supposed to be, not who people were beginning to question. And when family entered the frame, that strategy intensified. Unity became evidence. Loyalty became shield. Any criticism was framed as an attack rather than an inquiry. Slowly, the conversation shifted from accountability to defense. But defenses only work as long as people accept the premise. What's different now is that the premise itself is being examined. The documentary never claims that one person caused everything. Instead, it presents a far more unsettling idea. That influence, when left unchecked, creates continuity. That environments shape behavior. That power learned early doesn't disappear, it scales. And that's why this story doesn't end with fame or scandal. It circles back to beginnings, to how norms are established, to how boundaries are taught or blurred, to how silence is modeled long before it's ever used strategically. As the final moments unfold, viewers are shown how the past keeps resurfacing. Old interviews replayed with new understanding. Casual jokes heard plainly without the distraction of context. Moments once celebrated now carrying an undertone that's hard to ignore. It's not about rewriting history. It's about finally reading it without insulation. This is also where the legal and media tension reaches its quiet peak. Cease and desist letters, public denials, claims of defamation. All of them appearing not when the first documentary aired, but when word began spreading about what was coming next. Timing matters because it suggests awareness. It suggests concern. It suggests that this material touches something more sensitive than anything released before. And that's why people are watching closely now. Not just fans, not just critics, institutions, platforms, corporate partners. Everyone who once stood comfortably nearby is reassessing proximity. Because once a narrative tips, it doesn't ask permission. In the closing moments, the story returns to the present, to where things stand now, to new projects, new documentaries, new attempts to reclaim control of the narrative. But the contrast is unavoidable. On one side, a polished message of resilience and misunderstanding. On the other, years of footage, testimony, and patterns that refuse to stay isolated. The viewer is left with a choice, not about guilt or innocence, but about belief. Do you believe the version being sold now, or the version that emerges when everything is laid side by side? Because the most powerful takeaway here isn't outrage. It's clarity. Clarity about how power operates, how systems protect themselves, how influence is inherited quietly, and how truth rarely arrives all at once. It leaks, piece by piece, until ignoring it becomes harder than facing it. That's why this story doesn't end with a documentary. It enters a new phase, one where every past decision, every relationship, every moment of silence is reevaluated under a brighter light. And once that light is on, it doesn't turn off easily. If you've watched this all the way through, you already understand this was never about one man. It's about how power is built, maintained, and eventually questioned. And now that the questions are being asked steadily instead of loudly, the answers can't hide behind time anymore. So if you want to stay ahead of what comes next, not just react to headlines after they break, make sure you're subscribed. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Where do you think this story goes from here?